There is a particular point during prolonged silence when something changes inside an avoidant that they are unlikely to explain, openly acknowledge, or willingly let you see. It usually does not happen immediately. In the early stage, their defenses are still doing their job. They can tell themselves that your silence is temporary, that eventually you will reach out again, and that the familiar pattern between you has simply paused rather than actually ended. They may assume that sooner or later, you will return to the role you once occupied, bringing the connection back to the emotional arrangement they understood. But as the days continue and nothing happens, that certainty begins to weaken. You are not checking in. You are not trying to repair the distance. You are not fighting for their attention. And eventually, the truth becomes impossible to ignore. You have genuinely stepped away and chosen your own peace over repeatedly pursuing someone who kept making connection feel conditional. That realization can create a powerful internal conflict between longing, pride, shame, ego, and emotional defenses that were never prepared for this outcome. At the center of that conflict is an uncomfortable realization. Your decision to stop trying has exposed something they did not expect to see. You did not defeat them through confrontation. You did not manipulate them, threaten them, or make some dramatic declaration designed to get a reaction. You simply reached the point where continuing to chase a connection that repeatedly exhausted you no longer made sense. By choosing yourself, you unintentionally challenged the relational identity the avoidant had built around the connection. That is why understanding this moment matters. It is not simply about imagining that they are suffering or waiting for them to come back. It is about recognizing what your withdrawal can reveal about the dynamic itself, and more importantly, what the decision to stop participating in that dynamic has revealed about you. There may be some satisfaction in knowing that your absence finally became meaningful, but the greater reward is clarity. You begin to understand what changed, why the silence feels different now, and how much you have changed by becoming someone who no longer abandons themselves just to maintain access to another person. Start with the emotion that rarely receives enough attention in discussions about avoidant behavior: embarrassment. This feeling can become especially important after the other person stops pursuing them, because the avoidant often develops a particular identity within relationships. Beneath the surface, there can be an internal assumption that they are the less invested person, the one who can remain emotionally independent, the one who can decide when closeness is acceptable and when distance is necessary. They may experience intimacy as something they can approach when comfortable and retreat from when it becomes too demanding. Their behavior can quietly communicate, without ever being directly stated, that their attention is something you receive when they choose to give it. Their warmth appears, disappears, and returns according to their comfort level, while your desire for consistency becomes increasingly visible. As long as you continue reaching toward them, that internal story receives constant confirmation. They can interpret your effort as proof that they are less affected and therefore more in control. The relationship seems to reinforce the identity they have created for themselves. Then your silence interrupts the entire pattern. You do not argue with their behavior. You do not demand an explanation. You do not give them another emotional conversation that allows them to redirect the issue, become defensive, withdraw, or return temporarily before repeating the same cycle. You simply stop supplying the energy that kept the dynamic moving, and that creates a problem for the story they had been telling themselves. The person they expected to remain available is suddenly unavailable. The person they assumed would eventually reach out again does not. The person whose emotional investment once seemed obvious has quietly redirected that investment toward their own life. That is where embarrassment can begin to surface, because the avoidant may have to confront the possibility that their supposed position of emotional control was never as secure as they believed. They may realize that what they interpreted as your dependence was actually your willingness to keep trying. Once that willingness disappears, the entire balance changes. The silence becomes a mirror, and what it reflects back is not simply your absence, but the consequences of how they treated your presence. Suddenly, the person who built their entire identity around being the one who needed less is confronted with an uncomfortable feeling that resembles need far more closely than they ever expected. That is where the embarrassment begins. It is a private and deeply uncomfortable realization that the version of the relationship they believed in was not completely accurate. They were not as detached, unaffected, or emotionally independent as they wanted to believe. Somewhere beneath all that distance, they may have become attached to your presence in ways their carefully constructed identity never accounted for. And what makes that realization even harder is the way you handled your departure. You did not create chaos. You did not demand answers. You did not make their behavior the subject of some dramatic confrontation. You simply became quiet and stepped away with a level of composure they may not have expected. Being treated with more dignity by the person you repeatedly hurt can create a particularly painful form of embarrassment because there is nowhere obvious to place it. Now we need to look at the anger because it can be very real, and understanding where it comes from matters if you do not want to misinterpret it as proof that your decision to remain silent was somehow wrong. An avoidant may become genuinely angry when you stop participating in the familiar pattern. Not necessarily because you harmed them, but because you disrupted an arrangement they had quietly come to depend on. There may never have been a conversation where these expectations were established, yet the pattern itself created them. You were expected to remain reachable. You were expected to care enough to keep the connection alive even when they pulled away. You were expected to tolerate uncertainty while they maintained enough distance to feel emotionally protected. Their comfort depended partly on knowing that your investment would remain available whenever they decided to reconnect. When you stop providing that reassurance, the entire structure changes. The anger can therefore become a defensive reaction to losing a form of emotional security they never openly admitted they were receiving from you. And that anger can be especially revealing because underneath it, the avoidant may recognize that they do not have a legitimate reason to feel entitled to your return. You did not betray an agreement. You did not violate some promise that required you to remain available forever. You simply stopped pursuing something that was repeatedly costing you peace. That makes the anger difficult for them to explain, even to themselves. If they openly admit why your silence bothers them, they may also have to admit that they expected you to keep coming back, no matter how distant they became. They would have to acknowledge that they took your availability for granted. And that realization does not fit comfortably with the self-image of someone who sees themselves as reasonable, emotionally mature, independent, and fair. So the anger has nowhere clean to go. They may not be able to direct it honestly toward you because your decision is legitimate, yet directing it fully inward would require a level of self-examination they may not yet be ready to tolerate. The result is an uncomfortable emotional tension that remains unresolved beneath the surface. But underneath that embarrassment and anger is another emotion that matters even more: grief. This is the layer that can become difficult for an avoidant to face, because grief requires something they have spent considerable energy protecting themselves from acknowledging. It requires recognizing that something was valuable enough to be missed. It requires admitting that the person who is no longer there mattered. And once that value is acknowledged, the loss becomes real. The connection was not simply another option that could be replaced without consequence. Your presence had meaning. Your attention had meaning. The emotional familiarity between you had meaning. The very things they may have minimized while you were available can become surprisingly significant once that availability disappears. This is why grief can arrive later rather than immediately. When you were still reaching out, they could remain occupied with managing the relationship itself. They could focus on how much closeness felt comfortable, how much distance they needed, whether you were upset, and when they should respond. Your silence removes that entire system of management. There is no longer anything for them to regulate from a distance, no message to decide whether to answer, no emotional reaction to interpret, no conversation to postpone, no reassurance that you are still there waiting somewhere in the background. Instead, there is simply an empty space where your presence used to be. And when there is nothing left to manage, the feelings that were previously being managed can become much harder to avoid. The grief does not appear because silence is some calculated weapon designed to make another person suffer. That distinction matters. Healthy silence is not about provoking a reaction or forcing someone to chase you. It is about withdrawing your participation from a dynamic that no longer feels healthy or reciprocal. But once that participation ends, the other person may finally have to encounter emotions that were easier to avoid when you were still available. The absence becomes noticeable precisely because there is no longer anything distracting them from it. So what happens when the avoidant is carrying all of this at once? The embarrassment, the anger, the grief, the confusion, and the uncomfortable realization that your presence may have mattered much more than they allowed themselves to admit. Their response is often not what you would expect. In many cases, they move even farther away. They become more distant rather than less. They may appear colder, busier, more independent, or strangely unaffected. From the outside, it can look as though your silence had absolutely no impact. You might see them continuing with their routines, appearing perfectly functional, posting normally, interacting with others, or behaving as though the connection has already been forgotten. But external behavior is not always a reliable measurement of internal experience. When emotional pressure becomes overwhelming, someone with strong avoidant defenses may instinctively reach for the same strategy that has protected them before: distance. The greater the emotional activation becomes, the stronger their performance of self-sufficiency can become. More space can therefore be a defense against feeling, not proof that no feeling exists. This is why the next stage can be so confusing for the person who has chosen silence. You may expect your absence to produce an obvious reaction, yet instead you encounter more distance. You may think they do not care, they have moved on, nothing changed for them. But that conclusion can be premature. A person can be emotionally affected while simultaneously becoming less expressive. In fact, the very intensity of what they are experiencing may encourage them to retreat further into familiar defenses. They may convince themselves that they are better off alone. They may become unusually focused on work, routines, distractions, social activity, or anything else that allows them to avoid sitting still with what the absence represents. They may tell themselves that the relationship was never that important. They may reinterpret the past in ways that make the loss easier to tolerate. This does not necessarily mean they have processed the situation. Sometimes it means they are trying very hard not to process it at all, and this is where your silence becomes meaningful in a completely different way. Its greatest effect is not that it forces an avoidant to miss you, chase you, or suddenly become emotionally available. Its deeper effect is that it removes your participation from a cycle that allowed both people to remain trapped in familiar roles. You are no longer trying to convince them to value you. You are no longer repeatedly explaining why consistency matters. You are no longer attempting to decode every withdrawal or repair every moment of distance. You have stepped outside the pattern. Whatever they choose to do with the resulting space is theirs. They may eventually reflect, they may reach out, they may remain distant, or they may continue defending themselves against what they feel. But none of those outcomes needs to determine your next move. The most important transformation has already happened on your side. You stop measuring your worth by another person's willingness to show up for you. And once that shift becomes real, silence is no longer a tactic. It becomes a boundary. When an avoidant responds to your silence by creating even more distance, it does not automatically mean there is nothing happening internally. Sometimes the opposite is true. Distance can become the tool they reach for when their emotional experience becomes too difficult to regulate in any other way. They may become busier, quieter, less available, or even more determined to appear completely unaffected. From the outside, this can look effortless. Internally, however, maintaining that appearance can require enormous psychological energy. They are trying to preserve the identity of the person who does not need anyone, even while your absence is challenging that identity. Eventually, though, that defense can begin to lose its strength. There comes a point when genuine loss becomes difficult to suppress indefinitely. After some time, depending on the person and the depth of the connection, another stage can begin: involuntary reflection. They start thinking about you without deliberately choosing to do so. Those thoughts often appear when their usual distractions become weaker. It may happen early in the morning before the day becomes busy, late at night when everything becomes quiet, or during an ordinary task that leaves enough mental space for memories to surface. They may suddenly remember a conversation, a particular expression on your face, something you said, or the feeling of being emotionally understood by you. They remember moments when the defenses were lowered and the connection felt unusually genuine. They may think about qualities you noticed in them that other people overlooked, or moments when you understood something they never had to explain. What becomes difficult is not simply remembering you. It is remembering what they did with the connection while they had it. They may begin connecting their withdrawal, inconsistency, emotional walls, and repeated distancing with the outcome they are now experiencing. The consequences become personal rather than theoretical. The loss is no longer something happening somewhere outside them. It becomes something they can feel. This is where the deeper form of humility can begin. It is not necessarily a dramatic apology, a public admission, or some obvious gesture designed to bring you back. In many cases, it is much quieter than that. It is the private realization that their own choices contributed to creating the very absence they now dislike experiencing. They may begin seeing moments they previously dismissed differently. They may recognize that certain opportunities for closeness were available, and that they repeatedly stepped away from them. They may realize that your patience had limits, even if you never announced those limits, and they may finally understand that your continued presence was never guaranteed. This realization can be humbling because it removes the comforting illusion that they were simply observing the relationship from a safe distance while you carried all the emotional weight. They now have to consider their own role in what happened. The person they assumed would keep returning did not. The connection they believed could remain available whenever they wanted it became something they could no longer access on demand. But I want to bring the focus back to you because it is easy to become so interested in what may be happening inside the avoidant that you accidentally make their emotional reaction the new center of your life. Your silence was not supposed to become another way of monitoring them. It was not meant to turn into a strategy where you sit back and constantly wonder whether they are missing you, feeling embarrassed, becoming angry, or preparing to return. Silence becomes powerful for a very different reason when it comes from genuine self-respect. It is not a punishment. It is not a performance. It is not an attempt to create emotional pain so someone finally understands your value. Sometimes silence begins after someone has simply become exhausted from repeating themselves, waiting, explaining, accommodating, and hoping that the relationship will eventually become something it has repeatedly failed to become. There comes a point when continuing costs more than walking away. That point is not manipulation, it is recognition. It is the moment you finally acknowledge that your peace cannot remain dependent on another person's willingness to meet you. That turning point changes the meaning of everything. Before it, you may have organized your thoughts around their availability. You may have planned your responses around their moods, waited for messages, analyzed periods of distance, and tried to determine what version of them you would encounter next. After it, the center of gravity begins moving back toward you. Your decisions are no longer built around maintaining access to someone who repeatedly made access uncertain. You begin asking different questions. What do I need? What feels healthy for me? What kind of relationship am I willing to participate in? What am I no longer willing to tolerate simply because I care about someone? This is why genuine silence communicates more than a long confrontation sometimes can. You are no longer trying to convince another person that you deserve consistency. You are demonstrating through your behavior that you will not continue abandoning your own standards simply to preserve a connection. Your value is no longer something you are asking them to recognize. It has become something you are acting upon. And that difference can be significant to an avoidant who has spent much of their relational life protecting their independence. They may not immediately acknowledge it, and they may never verbalize it, but genuine self-possession can command a different kind of attention. The person who once kept reaching is no longer reaching. The person who once tried to repair every distance is no longer rushing to close it. The person who once made their emotional availability revolve around the avoidance behavior has become centered within their own life again. That can be difficult to dismiss because it cannot easily be argued against. You are not demanding that they respect you. You are simply living as though your own dignity matters. And there is an important distinction here. Respect does not mean they will automatically return, change, or become capable of the relationship you wanted. It means your behavior has demonstrated a level of self-possession that cannot be easily manipulated through the old cycle. Think about the contrast between the two forms of withdrawal. Their distance may have come through mixed messages, sudden changes in warmth, emotional walls, delayed responses, and repeated movement toward closeness, followed by retreat. Your distance is different when it comes from clarity. You are not trying to create confusion. You are not sending contradictory signals. You are not disappearing simply to see whether they will panic and chase you. You have reached a decision about what you will and will not participate in, and your behavior reflects that decision. That kind of withdrawal carries a different emotional quality because there is no hidden demand attached to it. You are not silently saying, "Come after me." You are saying, "I am no longer willing to abandon myself." And that message does not require an audience. Even if they never fully understand what happened inside you, the transformation remains yours. You stopped fighting for a place in someone's life and started protecting your place in your own. That is why the deepest meaning of your silence has very little to do with whether the avoidant eventually reaches out. They may not. They may reflect deeply and still remain defended. They may miss you and still be unable to offer consistency. They may understand what they lost and still lack the emotional capacity to build something healthier. Their reaction belongs to them. Your transformation belongs to you. The most powerful part of this entire process is not that you finally made someone else feel the weight of your absence. It is that you no longer need their reaction to validate your decision to leave. You did not have to win an argument. You did not have to prove that they were wrong. You did not have to make your pain louder so they would finally take it seriously. You simply reached the point where your own well-being became more important than keeping a connection alive at any cost. And sometimes that quiet decision communicates more clearly than any final conversation ever could.